So Bobby Conway from Cross-Examine put out his follow-up video to the video I responded to a little while ago about the divine hiddenness argument, so let's see what more he has to say.
According to John Schellenberg...
Sorry to stop you so early, but according to who?
According to John Schellenberg...
John Schellenberg. You might have just left off pronouncing the g at the end. That I could accept, but in the middle there was a really clear ing. Schellenberg. Listen again.
According to John Schellenberg...
It's not John Schellenberg, it's John Schellenberg. That's why there's an en in the middle. And just to be clear, I know this is petty, but even so, come on.
In his influential book, Divine Hiddenness and Human Reason, he contends that if an all-powerful God existed, then every reasonable, non-resistant person would come to believe.
No. I mean, his argument is based on some assumptions about God, and among those assumptions listed in the introduction on page 10 is the assumption that God, if he exists, is unsurpassably great. And among the list of features that Schellenberg minimally assigns to a God that's unsurpassably great are being ultimate, personal, all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, and perfectly loving. So yes, he is talking about a God assumed to be all-powerful, but the relevant feature, the one he's actually arguing about, the primary one that's important to the book, is the quality of being perfectly loving. The argument is about the idea that if there were a perfectly loving God, reasonable non-belief, that is, non-resistant non-belief that the non-believer is not culpable of voluntarily causing, would not exist. People would know of God's existence because that's a necessary precondition to have a relationship with God, which God desires to have with all of his children, being perfectly loving. Now, as for why being perfectly loving is included in a list of unsurpassably great attributes, I have some problems. Essentially, the reason for calling perfect lovingness part of being unsurpassably great is just that people value love, and he explains this on page 11. Love of the sort in question is clearly one of the highest manifestations of personal being. So if God is conceived as embodying the perfections of personal life, he must be conceived as perfectly loving. To which I would respond, is this really so clear? Not as a matter of your preference, but as a matter of objective truth? I don't even think that's always true subjectively. Another quotation, in the unconditional love of a Mother Teresa, for example, we see reflected a quality of being that most of us would intuitively say must belong to God if God exists. For it is something to which we are inclined to ascribe very great value indeed. When we reflect on the nature of such love, all the power and knowledge in the world fade by comparison. Well, I didn't realize that objective good and God's nature were democratically elected. By his fallen creation, no less. Or, if we're not assuming God's existence, by flawed and fickle humanity. If God is really assumed to be just whatever most of us happen to value, what does it even mean to talk about God as if he's real beyond us? It makes it sound like he's just some kind of representation of whatever the current popular will is. Or maybe he really is real, but he's bound to change with our opinions, who knows? Now, to be clear, I don't have a problem with Schellenberg using these assumptions. I do have a problem with his argument trying to justify them, but using the assumptions is perfectly sensible. He's granting the theists all their pet assumptions and using them against them to reach a stronger conclusion than simply your God doesn't exist, which is no God exists. Like, okay, you guys insist that any God must by definition have all these properties to be a God at all? Well, those properties conflict with reality, so no God can logically exist. This is the right approach. In giving them what they want, you take it away. In any case, when people seriously make these religious assumptions about what's great and what's not so great, seemingly just based on their emotions and preferences, and then attempt to use that to argue for some kind of supernatural thing, all I can do is roll my eyes.
As you can see...
Hold on just a second. Speaking of things I can see, I see at the bottom of the screen there that your Facebook page is Dr. Bobby Conway. I didn't know you were a doctor. You don't introduce yourself as a doctor. Well, this got me kind of curious about Dr. Bobby Conway, and so I went and looked him up. It's not relevant to anything, but it's interesting. So let's just take a look at the About page on his website quickly. Bobby Conway, apologist, author, speaker. I wish I could give you a list of all my great credentials growing up. Unfortunately, I can't. I earned a summa cum laude in sin. If I had to give you a list of words to describe me before becoming a Christian, it would look something like this. Insecure, angry, confused, uneducated, promiscuous, boozer, addictive, foolish, rebellious, and a decent baseball player. Right, so you were young, dumb, and full of cum. You were an idiot young man like so many others, and then you grew up. like so many others do with or without Christianity. This is not unexpected. In fact, it's expected, regardless of your religion. If you hadn't grown out of this phase, you would be called a man-child. Going through a phase like this is pretty typical. It's kind of getting accustomed to the new rights of adulthood before you settle into the responsibilities too. It never ceases to amaze me how often Christian testimonies are just, I was an idiot young man, and then eventually I wasn't anymore. Okay, but this isn't important. What about the doctor part? With a desire to be further equipped for ministry, I went to Dallas Theological Seminary, where I earned my Master's of Theology. I also have a Doctorate of Ministry in Apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. Right. No comment. That satisfies my curiosity.
He claims there are those who are non-resistant and don't believe because there hasn't been enough evidence to convince the non-resistant skeptic.
I think the word skeptic only shows up at one point in the book. In fact, it's the word skeptical, not skeptic. And that's in a reference to another writer's reference to skeptical feelings some people have toward accepting the evidence of other people's reported religious experiences. I think that's the only instance of this word in the book. I could be wrong, and so this is one of those times when I really wish this book had a better index. It's hard to remember every instance of every word off the top of my head. But overall, the argument isn't about skeptics specifically. What Schellenberg is talking about are non-resistant non-believers, and this category is made a little bit more granular on pages 59 and 60, which does include some people who you could consider to be skeptics. It includes non-believers and disbelievers who have reflected on the evidence and come to the conclusion that either the claim is not to be believed, but not to be believed false. That is, in Schellenberg's words, that there's epistemic parity between the claims that God and not God, which he makes sure to clarify on page 65 does not mean the belief that the claims are equally probable, but for example, to believe that the probabilities can't be determined right now. It's an evaluation of the evidence as being at parity, not that there's a 50-50 chance of either claim being true. So that's one type of reflective non-believer. The other type is the one who believes there's sufficient evidence to justify disbelief, believing to some degree of confidence that the claim of God's existence is false. These two groups form the reflective non-believers, the people who've reflected on this question and the evidence. And some of these people maybe you could classify as skeptics, but the other category of non-believers are the unreflective non-believers, the people who just haven't thought about it. And these people you would not call skeptics. Skeptic is much too narrow of a term.
So according to Schellenberg...
You gotta be kidding me. It's not Schellenberg. Am I just mishearing it? Is that just a quirk of how you're saying it? Maybe you're saying it right, or you mean to say it right, but it just comes out weird?
We've got a sender problem.
Yeah, you could say that. If there's a God who loves everyone and desperately wants to have a relationship with everyone, you would expect that God to, at the bare minimum, establish the truth of his existence to everyone, in some way that would be sufficient to convince them of his existence, not just some way that the Bible beats them over the head and says it totally should convince you, but a way that actually convinces them. And Schellenberg's overall point isn't really that we have a sender problem, it's that the idea of there being a sender problem in this way is inconsistent with God as defined, and therefore there's no sender at all, because it's logically contradictory. So I guess, yeah, maybe the sender does have a problem, but the sender's problem is he doesn't exist.
Let's consider a syllogism of Schellenberg's argument as found in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Why do you need them to summarize the argument for you? You could just summarize it yourself. I know Schellenberg spends 92 pages going through all the finicky details. There's a lot of discussion of definitions and possibilities and alternative interpretations and so on. But the basic argument is pretty simple. You don't really need to go to somebody else to tell you what it is, do you? You read the book already. At least so I assume.
Premise 1. There are people who are capable of relating personally to God, but who, through no fault of their own, fail to believe.
And there we don't have the V on the end of believe, which is more reason to think that you did not forget to pronounce the G at the end of Schellenberg. So what have we got going on here? Some kind of a noise gate situation? Would that do it? Let me try that. John Schellenberg, believe. John Schellenberg, believe. John Schellenberg. John Schellenberg. Believe. 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 John Schellenberg. Believe. Schellenberg. Yeah, dude, probably your noise gate. You got to turn that down a little bit.
Premise 2. If there is a personal God who is unsurpassably great then there are no such people.
Right, and again, unsurpassably great does not refer just to all-powerfulness. It refers to all the qualities that Christians tend to call great, including, and most importantly, perfect lovingness.
Conclusion. So, there is no such God. How might we respond?
Lots of ways. He spends the second half of the book talking about some of the ways. I didn't read that part, I'll be honest. I started reading the book kind of later than I wanted to, and I had some other stuff going on, and I just didn't get to it. I read the first half, that's the actual argument. I'll leave the rebuttals up to you.
Personally, I think the problem is with premise 1, through no fault of their own.
Yeah, I could have guessed. In the last video you brought up Romans 1:20. You said more than once, no one will be without excuse, which was the exact opposite of what you meant, but I knew what you meant.
This is problematic and assumes too much. We can't assume the person who perceives himself as non-resistant is so entirely objective as to not be blinded by other things which might be blocking his ability to capture a clear peak of God as one who exists.
Right, and Schellenberg doesn't assume that. That's not part of the argument. When Schellenberg talks about culpable non-belief, what he's referring to is an intentional choice. And not only a choice, but a whole intentional set of actions. In his introduction, Schellenberg agrees with me between pages 9 and 10 that belief is involuntary, by which he means that you can't just suddenly decide that you believe something different than you already do, and have that actually work. And he argues for this by saying, quote, "If we could decide to believe where formerly we had not, and our decisions were immediately efficacious, we would know that our beliefs were the result of our decisions, and not determined by how things are. But in that case, we would not have any reason to suppose that what we believed was true, and so would not really believe." But he does point out in a footnote on page 10 that you can change your own beliefs over a prolonged period of time through concerted, conscious effort. Quote, "Getting oneself to believe, for example, that there is a God when the evidence does not seem initially to support that belief requires deliberate self-deception, and such self-deception, since it involves viewing the evidence selectively and forgetting that one has done so, requires a considerable period of time." And this is one of the forms of culpable non-belief that Schellenberg talks about. But if, as you say, the reason that you don't believe there's a God is a sincere failure of objectivity, just a failure to be perfectly rational despite your best attempts, or the presence of something in your way blocking your ability to perceive the truth of God, that type of belief is inculpable. What you're describing is inculpable non-belief. You're giving examples of the thing to show that the thing you're giving examples of isn't a thing.
Among the things blocking us can be presuppositions,
which would be inculpable or non-resistant non-belief, assuming that you weren't intentionally adhering to knowingly faulty presuppositions. And I should point out that the subject of Chapter 2 is what it would look like for there to be a world where reasonable non-belief wasn't possible. And one of the criteria for that, in Schellenberg's view, is that the belief in God would be properly basic. That is, you wouldn't need to have other positions or other beliefs to start believing in it. It would just be something that you believe essentially by default. It would be your presupposition. That is, as soon as a person gains the capacity to have a relationship, in this case with God, that person would feel God's presence to the point of believing in God's existence without needing any arguments or evidence in favor of it. And the fact that this is not the case, the fact that this does not seem to be the default presupposition of human beings, forms part of the argument.
Unresolved traumas,
something which, to my recollection, doesn't come up in the book, but that as well could and probably would be non-resistant non-belief. You didn't choose to have traumas that prevent you from having the capacity to evaluate the evidence neutrally. This trauma that's blinding you to the evidence wasn't part of some plot on your part to convince yourself to not believe in God. This isn't something that you're doing to avoid belief. This is something that you've been afflicted with. Now, I think there are some cases where you could say that this non-belief is culpable. As Schellenberg points out on page 57, it's possible to engage in self-deception on the basis of bitterness or resentment. So in his definition of culpable and inculpable, I would say that there's at least a way to argue that some responses to some form of trauma could be seen as intentionally not believing, of being resistant. But some form of trauma that makes you constitutionally incapable of evaluating the evidence this fairly, a trauma that in some way affects your ability to reason adequately on this topic, even if that's not your preference, would not be you resisting. That would be you lacking the capacity to evaluate the information.
Disjointed, rational conclusions.
Being bad at reasoning and therefore not reaching a correct conclusion doesn't mean that you're resisting the conclusion. That one's easy.
And all sorts of other influences.
Right, influences. Very good word choice, because it implies that you're being influenced from something beyond your direct control, which means that you're not culpable for the results. The influence is culpable, at least in the sense that we mean in the context of this book.
There can be a combination of rational, relational, social, emotional, and volitional conditions that impair one's ability to be fruitfully objective.
And there it is again. There can be all these conditions that impair you, that impair your ability to be objective. Exactly. Circumstances that surround you can reduce your capacity to engage in reasoned thought, and therefore you can end up at the wrong conclusion through no intention of your own. If you're mentally impaired, and that impairment has certain results, nobody can say, well, you just chose not to do better. You didn't. All of this language that you're using, all this stuff you're saying is playing right into Schellenberg's argument. It really makes me wonder if you have any idea what argument you're even arguing against. What you seem to really be arguing against here is just some vague, poorly formed idea you've come up with about what the argument is. And as a result, it's totally self-defeating. But hey, I don't think you're doing that on purpose. You're probably just mentally impaired.
We cannot underestimate the effects of the fall and how it limits our capacity to remain free of bias.
Even more of an argument for inculpability.
No one is fully objective east of Eden.
Cool, so people will come to the wrong conclusion all the time because their minds just don't work so good. And therefore, by no fault of their own, they will fail to believe. Which is the premise you're attempting to disagree with and yet constantly arguing for.
Besides this, I think those who claim that they are truly non-resistant need to be honest about themselves and ask, am I really non-resistant to Christianity?
Go ahead. That doesn't really help you, Barry. Billy? Bobby. Because again, remember, in the category of non-resistant non-believers, one of the subcategories are unreflective non-believers, which include people like, for example, some random Buddhist guy in rural China who's never heard of Christianity or of its God. And the existence of these people is on their own enough to make Schellenberg's argument work. The version you took from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy makes this very clear. Premise 1. There are people who are capable of relating personally to God, but who through no fault of their own fail to believe. Well, our Buddhist guy out in the middle of nowhere is one of these people. He's not resisting your religion. He's never even met a Christian. He doesn't have the internet or TV. He doesn't know what the hell Christianity even is. He doesn't know what a God is. Are you seriously going to tell me that the only reason he doesn't believe in God is because he's intentionally choosing not to? How much more unreasonable and frankly resistant to the idea of non-belief at all can you get?
There are probably some features of Christianity that don't sit well with such non-resistant people.
This Chinese Buddhist guy has no idea what features Christianity has. Again, though, remember, we're not talking about Christianity here, we're talking about God. We're talking about the idea of people having a personal relationship with God. Christianity does not come up in the book, at least aside from the fact that Christian writers are referred to. Why are you talking about Christianity right now as though it's relevant?
Which undoubtedly is skewing their sight. Things like sin, hell, judgment, what the Bible has to say about sex.
And I'm saving that clip for the end.
One way at getting at the so-called non-resistant person's resistance might be to ask something like, so tell me, why don't you believe in Christianity?
And our Chinese Buddhist fellow will say, "Que, no hablo inglés." Yeah, that's right, I know Chinese.
At that point, we might get a brief download on some of their objections. And guess what?
It's not going to have anything to do with the point, as usual.
On hearing these, we will have entered the detection zone.
Oh my God, dude.
As those objections have just revealed where their resistance lies.
Okay, that I can't blame on a noise gate. Let me hear that again.
Where their resistance lies.
They're resistant? Did you write in your script where their resistant lies? And then you just read it out like that? Holy shit, you're worse than that guy from Anchorman.
As I conclude, Here is some advice I'd like to offer to the person who thinks they are non-resistant and yet wants to encounter God.
Wait, are we done with arguments about the book already? Are you telling me I read 100 pages of philosophical wankery just for that? Okay, I gotta say, man, you're talking about this book like you've read it, and it is incredibly obvious that you haven't. You don't appear to have the first clue what the argument that you're engaging in is even about. I do like, though, that the only thing you objected to in the argument is the first premise, that there are people who don't believe and it's not their fault. You didn't object to the validity of the argument or the soundness of the second premise, just that first premise, and that's great. Because the second premise is, if there is a personal God who is unsurpassably great, then there are no such people. I don't know if Schellenberg himself would approve of this statement of his argument, but this is the one you picked. And I like that because it means that as soon as someone disagrees with you and accepts that there's even one person out there somewhere who doesn't believe in your God but also isn't fighting against belief in your God, this will lead them straight to the conclusion that at least the Christian-style all omnis God doesn't exist. And I have to say, if Christians start accepting that that's valid, that dramatically lowers the bar for convincing them that God doesn't exist. Sweet. Keep making videos like this.
First, don't underestimate our ability to be skewed about our own biases.
Sure, I totally agree. You can totally have a whole bunch of biases just by accident. You might not even know it. Like you say, somebody might be totally underestimating their own bias, and the fact that they need you to tell them that shows that they're not doing that on purpose, and thus not being biased out of resistance, but just out of being human, experiencing some sort of intellectual failure. In other words, they're a non-resistant non-believer. So what you're bringing up here is an argument against your own point.
Second, ask yourself what you are looking for. Are you being realistic? Like expecting God to do something for you that he doesn't do for others who believe?
Yeah, well, the point of the argument is that we would expect a world in which a perfectly loving, unsurpassably great God exists to look different from the world we currently inhabit. We would expect that God to be doing different things than he seems to be doing if, in fact, he exists right now. And so, at the bare minimum, if a God exists, it's not perfectly loving. And by the definition Schellenberg's using, and the definition Christians usually use, that's not a God at all, because it's not unsurpassably great, according to them. So, I mean, yeah, the answer is yes. People are expecting God to do something other than what you say he does, but that's because he's internally inconsistent and thus illogical, unless he behaves in that different way. The argument's only 100 pages. In fact, it's less than half the book. Most of this book is dealing with possible rebuttals. You could have just at least read the argument, Doctor.
Have you set the bar so high so as to ensure that you'll always have a finger to point at the sender?
No, and in fact, the bar set in the book is incredibly low. Schellenberg basically says that personal experience is perfectly fine justification for belief. If you just had a strong feeling that God exists and loves you and that you have a relationship with him, that's good enough. And that if you felt this strongly and other people told you they felt it strongly too, that even arguments against God's existence, like the problem of evil, would be an irrational basis on which to lose your belief. And the only way that would happen is through culpable non-belief, through self-deception out of bitterness and resentment. This is such a low bar that I just can't agree with it. It's so low that I find it completely absurd. And yet, this is the bar that Schellenberg sets for the argument you're arguing against. He sets every bar as low as he can. He puts everything as much as he can in the theist's favor, and theism still fails. This is not about having unreasonably high epistemological standards, or even high ones. It's about having any standards at all. What you're basically saying is that if somebody requires any justification before believing whatever you tell them, they're being unreasonably resistant. What the hell's wrong with you?
Third, do you think it's realistic for you to be able to set the terms for how God should make himself known to you?
I think it's realistic to expect that a God with certain properties will act in accordance with those properties. And if he doesn't, then either he doesn't exist or he doesn't have those properties. Yes, expecting something to act like itself is abundantly realistic.
Fourth, ask yourself, what are your objections to Christianity?
It doesn't seem like it's true. I evaluated the evidence as best I could, and it didn't make any sense whatsoever. And I've been doing that for like 12 years. And I still literally have not seen one piece of evidence or one argument that I find compelling at all. You're insinuating this is some sort of an emotional distaste? I believe all kinds of crap I find emotionally distasteful. I don't deny the existence of spiders and maggots because I don't like them. In fact, I'm well known for having many things that I dislike. That doesn't mean I plug my ears and close my eyes and try to pretend they don't exist. That's dumb. Is it possible that the resistance here is more on your end? You don't want to even acknowledge that there are people out there who disagree with you because they think your arguments suck? It's real rich to be accused of resistant non-belief when you pull crap like that.
As mentioned, it's there you might detect where your resistance has escaped you.
It's there you might detect where your resistance has escaped you. It's there you might detect where your resistance has escaped you. What are you trying to say? Okay, the there is in questioning what your objections are to Christianity. That's the there. I don't know why you're calling that there. So in doing so, you might detect where your resistance has escaped you, in the sense of has avoided being noticed by you. I guess that's okay. But it's not where your resistance has escaped you, it's that your resistance has escaped you. So in doing so, you might detect that your resistance has escaped you. There, now you have a sentence that doesn't just sound like gibberish. You're welcome.
Fifth, don't quit seeking. Humbly ask God to help you, even with your unbelief.
Somebody who's going to do that sincerely is clearly not resistant to belief. That's a non-resistant non-believer. You realize that, right? So again, you play right into Schellenberg's hands. You acknowledge the existence of non-resistant non-believers that you're trying to deny. And that's the only premise of the argument as you presented it that you said is a problem. The one you keep demonstrating is completely sound. How do you defeat yourself so consistently? And you script these videos in advance. You're reading off a fucking teleprompter or your computer screen or whatever. How do you fail this badly when you have all the time in the world to think? And meanwhile, I'm sitting here just talking into my microphone. And yet I know I'm not shooting myself in the foot constantly like you are. That might have something to do with the fact that I understand the topic at least, you lazy ass.
Finally, I'd say, while you may not have the experiential sense of contact that you'd like, don't underestimate the evidence Christianity has on offer.
Okay, so what about the people who didn't underestimate the evidence and then looked at it and then still didn't believe? Oh, right, they apparently don't exist. That's what. Your evidence is so amazing that the only possible way to not think it demonstrates your God is to intentionally deceive yourself. Look, man, there's no way for me to convince you otherwise. You've decided that nobody who disagrees with you sincerely exists. You're completely entrenched in your resistance to this belief. I know I'm not going to convince you otherwise, so what's the point in trying?
Just because God's presence isn't obvious doesn't mean his presence is non-existent.
Listen to what you just said. When you say that his presence isn't obvious, that means that people can fail to believe it on the basis that his presence isn't obvious. This is another argument for the reality of non-resistant non-belief. How do you not hear yourself? In any case, what you just said is basically just an assertion that Schellenberg is wrong, because his basic point is that if a perfectly loving God existed, its presence would be obvious. Now, maybe you disagree with this, but you haven't argued against it. You just said a bunch of other random crap that doesn't pertain to the argument. Your assertion means nothing.
The gospel is a powerful case for God's love.
That one's the noise gate.
Demonstrating the distance he came in the incarnation to reconcile us to God. The evidence of his death and resurrection can't be ignored.
Okay, I haven't ignored it. It's just crap. I know that you find that concept utterly inconceivable. And again, I'm not going to try to convince you that I'm non-resistantly not believing. Frankly, your opinion on this matter means nothing. You appear to be a man of little insight or importance.
The arguments against the resurrection are so weak that one is more rational to believe in the evidence for the resurrection than to believe in the evidence against it.
Ah, well, I'm sure it feels that way to you, Bobby, but remember what a man once said.
We cannot underestimate the effects of the fall and how it limits our capacity to remain free of bias. No one is fully objective east of Eden.
Or how about this one?
Among the things blocking us can be presuppositions, unresolved traumas, disjointed rational conclusions, and all sorts of other influences. There can be a combination of rational, relational, social, emotional, and volitional conditions that impair one's ability to be fruitfully objective.
Or was all that supposed to only apply to everyone except you?
All that to say, it may mean trusting in the evidence of the resurrection and following him, even if it means you are apparently bereft of the kind of experiential contact with God you were in search of.
Oh, I totally get that that may well be required to join your religion in the real world. So does Schellenberg, which is the problem that forms the basis of the book. You remember there was a book that you were talking about? No?
In time, through faith and obedience, I believe if you truly seek him, you shall find him.
Right, this God that supposedly wants a relationship with you and perfectly loves you is hiding himself away, making his presence not obvious, giving you no experiential contact with him, and expecting you to have infinite patience going through the given rituals of one particular arbitrarily chosen religion, with tons of time and opportunity to fail to find him, and to become discouraged and give up, as a result of which he will deny you salvation and toss you in hell. And more in line with the actual point of the argument, deny you a relationship with him. And as the argument goes, this isn't exactly the behavior of a perfectly loving God who wants a relationship with you. This isn't consistent with someone loving you and wanting to be with you. As Schellenberg points out in the preface to the paperback edition, this is more consistent with a distant father. And the reason people are prepared to accept this kind of behavior from a supposedly perfectly loving being is because they're used to accepting shitty human behavior like fathers who don't care about their kids. Those are very much my terms, not Schellenberg's. Again, you keep trying to argue against Schellenberg, and you keep arguing in favor of his position instead. Do we chalk the blame for this miserable failure up to you, or to your religion, or to both? And again, I should point out, if there's someone out there who's truly seeking God, and yet has not yet found him, what better example of a non-resistant non-believer could you possibly have? And you yourself are talking about these people as if they exist, in a video denying the existence of the non-resistant non-believer. This entire video has just been you building up support for the one premise you decided to try to show was unsound. This is harder to watch than if you'd gone to race in the Olympics and kept tripping over your own feet.
For again, no receiver will be without excuse.
Are you kidding me? You still think it's no one will be without excuse? I corrected you on that. I don't expect that you would watch my video, but did nobody else correct you? Listen to the words you're saying. Or for that matter, read the goddamn verse in the Bible that you're trying to quote. It's right there. Well, that is the end, everybody, and man, I'm glad we're ending on that note. That is hilarious. He seems to just really think that's what the verse says. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you would, before you go, please do give the video a like and click subscribe if you haven't. And if you really like the channel, please consider supporting. A couple bucks per video or per month helps a huge amount. And big thanks to all of my supporters who've already made that choice. For early access, email list.logicked.com, and I'll see you next time.
Sex,